Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Loretta Lyons. I am the programming librarian at Guilford Free Library. We are pleased to welcome you to our second talk in a four-part series, co-sponsored by the local initiative, Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford. Before I turn it over to Doug Nygren, a few notes about tonight's format. The program is a 1-hour webinar. Dr. Freeman's remarks will run about 45 to 50 minutes. We do hope to get to some questions, which you may enter in the Q&A tool, which is found at the bottom of your screen. Since we have a large group tonight, please limit your inquiry to one question and please be as brief as possible. We may abbreviate questions or consolidate multiple questions with a similar theme for the sake of time. Thank you for joining us tonight. And now I'd like to turn it over to Doug Nygren, who is the chair of Witness to History and Slavery in Guilford. Doug?
Thank you, Loretta. I'd like to express my gratitude to you and to the Guilford Free Library for hosting Dr. Freeman's talk this evening. I'm Douglas Nygren, and I'm chair of Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford. We seek to uncover the missing history of slavery in Guilford, examine its legacies, and share with our town what we learn. If you would like to know more about us, please visit our website, slaveryinguilford.org, slaveryinguilford, one word, .org. I'd like to begin by telling a story. A few days ago, a friend of mine asked, Doug, just why are you doing this? I answered him, to learn. You know, I had lived in Guilford for more than 30 years before I learned that slavery had once existed here. I had grown up thinking slavery only happened in the South. The subject wasn't taught well when I was in school 50 years ago. It was only in recent years that this has slowly begun to change. 4 years ago, the Southern Poverty Law Center published a study that found of 1,000 high school seniors queried, only 8% knew that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. More than 2/3 didn't know that it took a constitutional amendment to end slavery. In all of the 1,000 students in the study, more than 90% revealed one way or another that they suffer from false thoughts, misinformation, or ignorance about slavery and racism. Our schools and our textbooks need to do better. We need to know what happened. But what have you learned, my friend asked. Many things, I answered. I've learned how little I know about slavery and the suffering it caused. I've learned that facing our history of slavery isn't easy. It demands strength, courage, and persistence. I witnessed that here in Guilford. 8 individuals have stopped me on the street or called me up to say that our project had prompted them to research whether their ancestors had owned slaves. They were shocked to learn their ancestors had. What impressed me about these individuals was their ability to share what they had learned and to overcome any personal shame that might cause. This could not have been easy. This evening, we will hear from our Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Paul Freeman, talk about education in Guilford. Dr. Alan Myers of our team will introduce him.
Thank you, Doug. Dr. Paul Freeman has been a Connecticut educator for almost 30 years and the superintendent of Guilford Public Schools since 2011, as well as an instructor at the UConn School of Education. He also has been honored to serve as the current president of the Connecticut Association of Public School Superintendents. I've known him since 2011, as I served on the Board of Education with him. There, I came to appreciate how much he values children and how he challenges all to think and to be creative, whether they be staff, special needs children, high achieving students, or members of the Board of Education. He's passionate about equality of opportunity and fosters group participation. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Freeman, who will speak on equality and social justice in Guilford Public Schools. Paul.
Thank you, Alan. I really appreciate that. It's good to see you again. And thank you, Doug, and thank you, Loretta. And thank you for the Guilford Free Library for inviting me to be here tonight. I particularly appreciated Doug's opening comments. And I do want to note that while I will make some references to the teaching of history and the approach to teaching of history in the Guilford Public Schools, what I really want to do is tell a story. I want to talk a little bit about our journey in the Guilford Public Schools with issues of race and racism and equity and social justice over the last few years. And so I'm going to ask for your patience as I chronologically sort of walk through a series of events, some local, some national, as well as a focus in the schools and how we have rolled out that focus here in Guilford. I want to add some other voices as we go through that. So I have some pieces that I will share with you, some pieces that have been published in Guilford or about Guilford along the way, and then hope to have time at the end there to respond to some questions. The overt work in Guilford Public Schools to begin really overtly talking about race and equity in our schools began in earnest in the summer of 2019. So in August of 2019, the leadership team invited Dr. Michael Moody, who is a founder of the Inside Education Group, to come and spend a day with us as a leadership team. So that was 21 of us. It was our 7 principals and our central office administrative staff and our assistant principals and special education coordinators, you know, the building level and central office level leadership team here in the Guilford Public Schools. And we asked Dr. Moody to spend a day with us. And I have the agenda with me from August 14th of 2019. And the objectives for that day were to begin the examination of race in our schools and its impact on us as leaders, both personally and professionally, to build common definitions of key terms as a means of laying the foundation for continued work on race and equity in our schools, and to explore key concepts and popular beliefs as a way to identify key challenges associated with equity work in our schools. And to a large degree, what we did that day was we looked at work that Dr. Moody brought to us. He brought research, he brought the national perspective, he brought the experiences of some other school districts. But really important to us, part of what we did that day is that we looked at a handful of some student communications. We shared among the leadership team emails and notes and communications that our high school students had shared with administrators at the high school about their experiences in Guilford Public Schools. And we looked at those and we thought really carefully about those students and their experiences in our schools. You know, in the Guilford High School right now, 1% of our student population identify as Black or African American. 6% identify as Latinx, and another 7% identify as Asian Americans. We felt it was really important to look at that population of students. Even though it's small, it represents a small percentage of our overall student population, but there are kids. And so part of what we did that day was ensure that we heard their voices. We wanted to make sure that we were bringing them into that conversation with us. On the heels of that conversation with Dr. Moody, as we launched into the school year, the leadership team engaged in 2 ongoing exercises as we wanted to continue this conversation around race and equity. One is that we followed a template that he had shared with us, where each one of us over the course of the school year wrote our own race autobiography. We began writing individually as a learning exercise about our own experiences with race as individuals, as people. And there were a series of prompts that I shared with the administrative team at intervals throughout the school year. It wasn't something that we did over one weekend. It was something that we tried to spread across the school year. Additionally, I asked the leaders in the team to read 2 really provocative and really challenging texts. I asked the leaders on our team and our leadership team, 21 of us, with one exception, we're all white adults. So we thought it was important as we thought about our own experience with race and the experience that our students have as they come into our schools to read 2 texts. We read Waking Up White and we read White Fragility. We bought 11 copies of each of those books and we shared them. Half of the group read one while the other half read the other, and then we shared our copies across the group so that we read those as the school year unfolded around us. As the year opened up in front of us then, and as we came to into September, there was then an event that occurred at Guilford High School that pushed us into the public arena. In September of 2019, a high school student arrived at a Guilford High School game wearing blackface. It spread across social media and it spread across the Connecticut news. It got picked up on some national news. It became an issue that we needed to address as a community. On the heels of that event, I released a letter to the Guilford public community, the Guilford schools community at large. And in that letter, I wrote this: "This incident does not reflect the students of Guilford as a whole. The students who I have come to know in Guilford are responsible and thoughtful and compassionate young adults who are offended by this incident as much, if not more so, than the adult community. No incident, however, occurs in isolation. If even one Guilford student felt that wearing blackface was acceptable or funny, then we have more work to do. As a community, we will continue to educate our students about racial relations, about racism and racist behaviors, and about ways in which to be more accepting and supportive of all." I do need to say that on the heels of that event, as the community talked and processed that event, I was shocked at how many individuals in this community, students and adults, told me that they didn't know what blackface was, or that they didn't know why blackface was considered to be offensive. And so it highlighted for us the importance of having these conversations. To Doug's point about going through school and not learning about slavery as a historical event, we were also recognizing that our students needed the opportunities to talk about race as a current event. In that same time frame, Superintendent Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez, who happens to be the superintendent of Hartford Public Schools, it was a Hartford football team who was visiting our school the night that that event occurred. Dr. Torres Rodriguez wrote about this event as well. What she wrote was this: "As the superintendent for Hartford Public Schools, and as a mother of 2 young men and students of color, I was disheartened, but determined to act when I heard the news. Another Connecticut student had appeared in blackface. This time it was a Guilford High School student who showed up to a football game against our Hartford Public High School team. One student does not represent an entire school or community. We know that. But the reality is that this is not the first incident in Connecticut targeted at students in recent years. Thankfully, this student was prevented from inflicting harm on our students and community by a responsible adult in the form of a resource officer. Centuries after the first American slaves were captured, bound, tortured, and killed to help build our new nation, the racist legacies of dehumanization still manifest both openly and in more subtle ways within our daily lives. It's not enough to be angry or hurt, though I experienced both emotions. Instead, we must choose to lift up our students and fellow adults when they exemplify positive change. To borrow Langston Hughes's words, I too am American." She goes on and continues to write, "Inclusivity takes continuous work. When we gather only with our own, with people that look like us, we lose the opportunity to learn about others. When we stay in our comfort zones, we exclude opinions, cultures, and traditions that are equally a part of the American fabric. But we can choose to bring our whole selves to our larger communities, to both learn and share ways to create stronger bonds and deeper connections." And in a follow-up communication, I wrote to the community reflecting on Dr. Rodriguez's words, "It is not our intention to put this one racist incident behind us. In fact, we believe it is incumbent upon us to talk about this incident so that something similar does not occur again. The elimination of intolerance, overt acts of racism, and unintentional acts of microaggression will not be done quickly or easily. It will not be comfortable, and it will not be done by the schools alone. It is a purpose which will require the schools and our families and our community to work closely together, but it is work to which we are committed and which we will wholeheartedly continue. So we had started our work that summer. We saw an isolated incident that reminded us of the importance of that work. And as we moved into the school year, we were further reminded that we had neighbors around the state who were doing the same work. In December of 19, the head of school of the Country Day School in Madison reached out to us in Guilford Public Schools and to Madison Public Schools. And he shared with us that he had invited an author to come to his school setting to talk about issues of race and equity in that private school setting in Madison. And on that evening in December, we did something that had never been done before. Parents and community members from Madison Public Schools, Guilford Public Schools, and the Country Day School came together. And in that evening, we listened to author Margaret Hagerman, who talked to us about her recently published book, which is entitled White Kids, Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. Well, it happened to be a snowstorm that evening, but we had over 100 community members who came together to talk about these topics, not just in our schools, but in our communities. And it was really exciting to see those three communities coming together and working collaboratively to talk about how can we help our students be more comfortable having these challenging conversations and to be that positive change that Dr. Torres Rodriguez was talking about. Now, continuing to work on that, we put together a community-wide event last year that we were really excited about. So in fact, scheduled for March 11th, exactly 1 year ago tonight, we had worked really long and hard in Guilford Public Schools to put together a night that was going to be focused on student identity as they came into our schools. And we had brought together a panel of experts. We had experts from organizations like True Colors, from the Anti-Defamation League, from the Connecticut Center for School Change, from St. Joseph's University, and from the educational arm of the Mashantucket Pequot tribe. Those adults were coming into our setting to talk to our community in the evening about student identity and the identities that they bring into schools with them and how our school could better support students from all of those various groups. That event was scheduled for March 11th last year. It was canceled because of the pandemic. It was the first event that we canceled in response to the pandemic, and in just a number of days after that, we had closed our schools. We had closed our schools and shifted to electronic distance learning instruction for what became the rest of that school year. The work that we were doing on race and equity was sort of endangered at that time. As we shifted into the pandemic, as teachers went from teaching in person to electronically over the course of a weekend, that work became endangered a little bit. It looked like it was going to possibly stall or be delayed as we responded to the more immediate events that seems to be unfolding in front of us. And then in May of last year, George Floyd was killed. And in response to that, we began receiving communications from students and from their parents and from really recent graduates. The Board of Education and I received over 200 communications in a very short period of time, many of which came from recent graduates. One of those I want to share in part with you tonight. This email is very reflective of many of the emails that we received. This particular email was written by a student who graduated from Guilford Public Schools in 2009. She writes in her email, "I'm writing to you in regard to racial justice issues in Guilford. In the past weeks, protests have taken place around the world to bring awareness to the racial injustices within their respective communities. We are no exception. It is necessary for us to confront the racial issues that are present in our own town. The reason I chose to read this particular email, the part that makes this one unique, she shared in this paragraph. After graduating from Guilford and finishing university, I have become an international school teacher, teaching first grade in Japan, Belgium, and now in Bulgaria for the last 7 years and continuing. I have been able to teach a diverse group of students who have taught me so much about the world. Even with this exposure, my education of racial justice will never end. I want to continue to learn and make changes to become a more culturally aware global citizen. When I reflect back on my time in the Guilford Public Schools, however, I see there was a shortage of culturally responsive curriculum. I am asking that the Guilford Public School systems take action, beginning with a commitment to, and she's got a list. She asks us to commit to completing an audit of the current curriculum K through 12, using a culturally responsive curriculum rubric, to provide comprehensive training for all teachers on how to discuss race and lead difficult discussions on these topics, including anti-bias training, to discontinue the mascot and moniker of Guilford High School from a Guilford Indian to something that is not racist in nature, to ensure accountability and transparency when racist, xenophobic, or culturally insensitive acts or comments are made, to hire a more diverse teaching workforce at all levels, and to make a public statement committing to these specific actions. Again, we received over 200 such emails from community members, current students, and again, those recent graduates who wanted to talk to us about their experience in the Guilford Public Schools. In a similar time frame, that leadership team that I mentioned, the 21 building and central office leadership principals and administrators in the district, collaboratively, we shared on June 3rd an email, a letter with our community. And in part, that letter read, as educators, we know that we share the responsibility of bridging the divide that inequity and racism create. School districts play a critical role in bringing people together, and by joining with our community, we can create change. But we also know that words will not be enough. We must unite in more than a call to action to effect change. We must take purposeful action to address systemic injustice. Together, we have the strength and the will to act. That is our goal. That will be our plan. Again, these events occurred in May and then in June while we were in the process of closing our schools down. That email and a number of emails like that one called on the administration and on the Board of Education, among some other things, to address the question of the Guilford High School Indian mascot. That was a significant part of what was being asked for in those exchanges. The Guilford Board of Education, even in the face of the pandemic, did continue to take up that question. I do want to direct all of you to a meeting of the Guilford Board of Education that took place on June 22nd. That meeting is archived and it is available for you to view on our Guilford Public Schools website. In that meeting, Dr. Glenn Matoma from UConn, he's a professor at UConn. He teaches in both the School of Education as well as the School of Human Rights, and Chris Newell from the Accomack Educational Initiative joined the Board of Education. And they led us through a conversation about the implications of our mascot. At that meeting, we shared position statements from most of the tribal nations that surround Guilford in the general Connecticut area. And following that meeting, we hosted a meeting of public comment where we asked community members to come out and speak about the mascot. Again, I want to really encourage those of you who are here in attendance tonight to watch that meeting from the 22nd, June 22nd. Dr. Matoma does a wonderful job leading us through that important conversation and talking about the importance of that decision. And on June 29th, the Guilford Board of Education voted unanimously to end the use of the Guilford High School Indian as the mascot or moniker for our Guilford High School. That was a difficult and an emotional conversation. And for some, that was a difficult and an emotional decision to take. I spoke with multiple community members who have been in the Guilford community for decades and took pride in their high school and in the mascot that had carried their high school forward for the last 70 years. Now, we learned during that experience, Guilford High School and the Guilford School District have been in existence in some form for 140 years. The Indian has only been our mascot, was only our mascot for the last 70 of those years until that June 29th meeting. Prior to that, for 70 years prior to that, we had been the Guilford Rams. That was an important decision in this story. And on the heels of that, I again wrote to the community about that change. And in part, my communication included this. As superintendent, I have been complicit and in large part responsible for not discontinuing the use of this mascot sooner. And for that, I'm truly sorry. I want to thank the friends and constituents who were honest enough to bring this failure to my attention and persistent enough to continue to do so over time. I will learn from this experience and I will continue to learn moving forward. As a school system, we are committed to conducting a curricular audit and to continue teacher training around the topics of race, racism, justice, equity, and identity. We are continued not to erasing Guilford's history, but to elevating it and to interrogating it in a healthy educational manner. We are committed to removing racist symbols, not as a way to avoid talking about race, but rather as a visible first step in talking more openly about racism in our community and in our schools. We did not view the mascot decision as the end of our work. The mascot decision in many, many ways was the beginning of our work. Very much in the same time frame as school was coming to a close and as protests continued across the country, as teachers were leaving after having been out of their classrooms for 3 months and going off into a summer that was going to be full of uncertainty for them about how we were going to be returning to schools next year. I purchased copies of Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and offered copies of those to every teacher in the Guilford school system. It was offered with an invitation for them to spend some of their summer reading that book. At the time, that book was becoming prominent in mainstream media, and it was becoming very common as it was discussed in educational circles around the country. We had students who were writing us emails asking how we were going to be addressing issues like these in our schools, and we had a country that was wrestling with questions of race and identity. I thought that it was appropriate that our teachers be given an opportunity to read a provocative text that would challenge their thinking around those topics. And then as that summer unfolded around us, and we planned for how we would reopen schools the following summer, we thought about the commitments we had made after an incident of blackface, after the killing of George Floyd, after receiving the letters from our students, and after making one important decision around our mascot. We thought about the commitments we had made to our community. We thought about the learning that we continued to see in front of us, and we began planning for the rollout of this school year. So on September, in that the last week of September, that last week of August, that first week of September, as we were bringing students back to school, we engaged in some teacher learning and adult learning like we had never engaged in before. We had 7 committed adult days before students returned to school. In those days, there were a number of things that our teachers needed to address. We needed to go over the new safety and health protocols that were being rolled out in every single one of our schools. We had new schedules that we were implementing in all of our schools. We had to provide technological support for the hybrid schedule that was going to require teachers to live stream their classes and meet with half of their students in a Zoom meeting while the other half were with them in person. At the high school, we spent half a day talking about gender identity. In all of our schools, we offered a half-a-day training on trauma-informed instructional practices because our kids were coming back to school not after a summer, but after a season of having been away from their teachers in their classrooms. And within that, we offered half a day to talk about culturally responsive instructional techniques. That was training that was delivered to every teacher in the school system. It was delivered by our principals and by our instructional coaches. And to be clear, I want to read to you the definition from the National Education Association around cultural competence and culturally responsive instruction. The National Education Association writes, cultural competence is the key to thriving in culturally diverse classrooms and schools, and it can be learned, practiced, and institutionalized to better serve diverse students, their families, and their communities. Cultural competence is the ability to successfully teach students who come from a culture or cultures other than our own. It entails developing certain personal and interpersonal awarenesses and sensitivities, understanding certain bodies of cultural knowledge, and mastering a set of skills that, when taken together, underlie effective cross-cultural teaching and culturally responsive teaching. So within the whole cornucopia of what was facing our teachers as we returned this September, culturally competent instructional teaching pedagogy was placed front and center with all of those other things that we were asking of our teachers this year, because last year had helped to illustrate to us how important that was. At the beginning of every school year, as we kick off every school year, the Board of Education spends time looking back at our vision and mission, looking at the priorities that have been stable in Guilford schools for about 10 years now, but also really specifically setting a slate of initiatives that they charge the school leadership with implementing every school year. Most year, there are 5 or 6 initiatives that are on our plate as we open that school year. This September, as the Board of Education talked about what initiatives should be front and center, what initiatives must be foregrounded for our schools this year, they only identified 3. And those were officially approved by the Board of Education after discussion and deliberation on October 13th of 2020. The first of those initiatives is that we will maintain health and hygiene protocols and practices to provide a safe and healthy in-person environment for all students and members of the school community. Obviously, that needed to be our first priority. That was the first thing on our plate, and we needed to make sure that we could open and maintain healthy schools, even though we only opened them partially in the beginning of the school year. The second initiative for this year was that, the leadership team was tasked with supporting a blended learning environment that promotes deep learning in academic disciplines, as well as social and emotional wellness through trauma-informed and digitally responsible instructional practices and expectations for students attending school both in person or virtually. Obviously, that needed to be our second initiative. First, we needed to make sure the schools were healthy, and then we needed to make sure that we were focused on our mission of teaching and learning. We had to master the technological challenge of a hybrid schedule. And teachers rose to that challenge, and it hasn't been perfect, but teachers shifted from in-person learning to first fully distant learning last year, and then a blended model this year. And we've worked doggedly to support them in their classroom instructional technique to meet that need. But then third, the third priority that this Board of Education adopted and approved on October 13th of 2020 was to further develop a culture and instructional practices that foster equity and social justice in our school community. We have been charged by the Board of Education to continue this work. We know that we knew that we were entering into a pandemic year in schools, but we also knew that we could not walk away from that responsibility. On October 26th of this year, Dr. Anine Crystal hosted a meeting of the Guilford Board of Education Curriculum and Instruction and Assessment Committee. That meeting is also archived and available for you to view on our website. I want to encourage you to go to that meeting as well. In that meeting, teachers, social studies teachers, Ralph Russo from Guilford High School and Tom Bushnell from Adams Middle School talked specifically about our approach to social studies and history in the teaching in the schools. They specifically addressed the ideas that Doug mentioned when he kicked off this conversation. We talked about how we teach history in our schools as an event that happened hundreds or thousands of years ago, but also how we connect that event to current events and to the reality that we live in today. Like Doug, we recognize that our students are not as versed in some historical events as they need to be in order to understand the complexity of those events. And so again, I want to encourage you to take a look at that curriculum, instruction, and assessment. It might be abbreviated to CIA on our website, but please look for that CIA meeting. And then, as this year unfolded, we continued to layer the training. And I want to talk to you, we didn't just do a half a day of training for every teacher in the school district. We've continued that work from the end of August, the beginning of September, through the year. So building on that foundation that we built with every teacher in the district in September, we have then had another series of activities that we've engaged in. So first, with our instructional coaches in the school system, an instructional coach is a full-time professional developer who works in the Guilford Public Schools. These are professionals that we hire to help make our teachers better professionals every day. In every term of the word, they're coaches. Just like a baseball team employs a pitching coach, we employ instructional coaches. As the year continues, all of those instructional coaches who work with all the teachers in Guilford Public Schools have continued to meet with Dr. Don Seiler. Don works for the University of St. Joseph here in Connecticut, and he has been working with our instructional coaches as the year began and as the year unfolds. And Don is continuing to work with them on culturally responsive and sustaining instructional techniques. He's training the coaches are learning collaboratively with Dr. Seiler, and the coaches then continue to take that work back into their classrooms. And in September, we talked about culturally responsive instruction. Now we're talking about culturally responsive and sustaining instruction. And the New York State Education Department has an incredibly helpful document that we have been using to model that work. In that document, they define culturally responsive and sustaining education as including 4 elements: creating a welcoming and affirming environment, fostering high expectations and rigorous instruction for all students, identifying inclusive curriculum and assessment, and engaging in ongoing professional learning and support. So as Dr. Seiler continues to work with our classroom teachers, that's the vision that he's working towards. And then those coaches bring that to the teachers in their buildings on a regular basis. As Dr. Seiler is working with the instructional coaches, we also brought in Dr. Sharon Locke. Dr. Locke was previously an assistant superintendent for curriculum in the New Britain schools. She was then a highly recognized superintendent in the Naugatuck schools, and now she works for ACES, a regional educational support center. Dr. Locke, across the school year, has been having a conversation with all of our principals about creating the environments in the school settings that can foster more culturally responsive and sustaining instructional practices in the classroom, growing more equitable schools. Dr. Locke has been working with all of our principals collaboratively as a group, as a professional learning community, and will also be working with each of our principals individually. And Dr. Locke, in fact, went out and on her own secured a grant that she's using to offset the cost of her work with us here in the Guilford Public Schools. Another layer on that is that a number of superintendents from shoreline communities from Guilford to Stonington have been working through the Learn Educational Resource Center with Dr. Lee Title from Harvard. So I'm continuing to work with Dr. Title and a number of other superintendents about how do you shape this work at the board and at the community level. And so what I hope that you're seeing as you listen to these pieces that we've layered is that, as Dr. Torres Rodriguez said, this work will not be easy. This work will not be without some discomfort. But what we've tried to do here in the schools this year is build a nested system where the teachers are getting some direct instruction, the coaches are being supported as they support the teachers, the principals are being supported as they support the coaches and the teachers, and I'm working with a collaborative group of superintendents to try to learn how to better assess and support the Board of Education and the community and the principals as we do this work in our school system. And we're really proud of the fact that we have worked to create this nested system where we're trying to touch all of those pieces. But there's two other really, really important pieces. The teachers are essential. And when you think about the core of instruction, Richard Elmore, also from Harvard, tells us that there's three important pieces. One is the teacher piece. And you can see that we're working on supporting the teachers in their instructional moves in the classroom. The other is the curricular piece. And not only does Elmore tell us the importance of curriculum, but we heard students and graduates tell us about that in their emails as well. So also working with Dr. Seiler, in addition to his work with the coaches, is working with all social studies and English language arts teachers in the system, grades 5 through 12, with Dr. Crystal to evaluate, to look at our curricula in both of those subject areas, both in social studies and in English language arts. We are, in fact, using a culturally responsive instructional rubric, and we're looking at those curricula. We're challenging ourselves on whether those curricula meet the needs of all students, whether they teach history in the way that Doug spoke about when he introduced this meeting tonight, and in a way that we can continue to support moving forward. Dr. Seiler will be presenting the recommendations that he and the teachers make, and those may inform curricular changes that the Board of Ed chooses to make moving forward. And the third piece that's really important, the instructional core is built around teachers and content and students. The third important component is the student experience. And so again, we've asked Dr. Seiler, and reaching all the way back to that first summer work we did with Dr. Moody, where we looked at some student emails that shared their concerns. Dr. Seiler is going to be meeting with students at the high school, and he's going to be talking to them about their lived experiences. Anecdotal data are as important as any other kind of data. Dr. Seiler is going to be talking to a large group, a diverse group of students about their experiences in the high school. And he's also going to be talking to students who fall within that 7% of the student population that I mentioned, students who identify as Black or African American or Latinx. And he's going to be asking them specifically about their experiences in our schools. And he's going to be asking what we can learn from their experience. And when we report out at the end of this year, we're not just going to be talking about our learning as we've talked about these approaches together as educators. We're not just going to be talking about the curriculum review and changes that we may want to make in our curriculum moving forward, but we're also going to be listening to the student voice, because that needs to continue to drive this work. That is an important commitment that we've made as we move forward in this conversation. Another really important development for this school year, and in fact, it is one of the brightest spots for me in this school year, as we have been doing this work internally within the schools, working with teachers, working with coaches, working with administrators, looking at curriculum, talking about texts, as we've been doing that work internal to the schools, it has been incredibly uplifting to watch the organic development of A-bar committees at all of our PTO levels. All of our schools in the district have PTO organizations. And each of the schools calls them something a little bit different. The high school calls it Connections, I believe. But there's a parent-teacher collaborative organization at all of those levels. In all of our schools, those organizations, those parent-teacher organizations, have spun off A-bar committees, anti-bias, anti-racism committees, groups of parents who want to know how they can support the schools in this work. In fact, how they can push and challenge the schools. One of the most common things I hear when I meet with those A-bar groups is too little, too late. You're not doing enough and you're moving too slowly. What more can you do to move in this direction? So I am really, really encouraged as we listen to those parent groups that are forming around this work. And I encourage them to keep off asking those challenging questions. What more can we be doing? to support all of our children in our schools, because supporting all of our children benefits all of our children. And then I want to close, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here, and I know that we said that we were going to leave some time open for questions. I want to close by noting a few pieces that have been included into our budget, not for this school year, right? We started talking in the 18-19 school year. We went through the 19-20 school year. We've just been talking about our initiatives in the 2021 school year. But the Board of Education also just approved their budget for the 21-22 school year. And in fact, the Board of Finance just finalized the amount of that budget last week. And this Monday, the Board of Education really finalized the line item distribution of that budget this year. That budget includes some small, but I think really important investments in this work moving forward. And I want to highlight just two. There's a number of things to be excited about in this year's budget, but there's two that speak primarily to tonight's conversation. One is the idea of offering an equity family liaison. So in this budget, we are setting aside $25,000. We are identifying a contract position that we think will be available to us approximately 10 hours a week. It'll probably be more in the beginning of the year, but it's going to be paid for in a contract fashion. We're looking to bring an individual into the school system who can be a liaison, as the name suggests, a bridge between students and families who may identify as part of marginalized groups, any marginalized group, and this school system. We had toyed with the idea of ombudsman at one point, or ombudsperson, but we decided to go with liaison. We think it is a more positive framing of the position. The idea here is that we're going to bring in somebody who is experienced and who understands how public school systems, buildings and districts operate, how they work. It needs to be somebody who's knowledgeable with the workings of a public school system. It also needs to be somebody who will be invitational and approachable by members of this community who identify as members of minority or marginalized groupings. And again, it doesn't matter if you identify as part of such a group because of racial or ethnic background or religious affiliation or gender identity or gender itself, but this person will make themselves available to our student and parent community. Any student or any parent who feels that their needs aren't being met or that their child isn't being treated fairly because of an affiliation with one of those marginalized groups will be encouraged to reach out to this individual. This individual will have a reactionary responsibility first to support that family, to listen to and then to coach and advise that family on the workings of the system and how best to move through that system and support your children. If necessary, the person can reach out as a liaison between the family and the building administration. This individual will not be reaching out to teachers directly, but to building principals, to building administrators, to help smooth the conversation between those two if necessary. And if necessary, this person will be empowered to advocate for the family with the building administrator as well. But most importantly, this individual will also be communicating with me directly and reflecting upon what we're seeing in those communications. Currently, students or families who have those types of concerns might reach out to their classroom teacher. They might reach out to a guidance counselor, school counselor. They might reach out to a building level administrator. They might talk to a friend for advice. They might reach out to me, the superintendent, or, and what's concerning, is they might not reach out at all. And so right now, those concerns are diffused across the system. There isn't one place where we can hear all the concerns, support all the concerns, but also draw clear conclusions from how those concerns are shared. This position will be put in place to do all of that. Additionally, in this budget next year, we will be participating, and this is really exciting, we will be participating with 25 other school districts across the state of Connecticut in a teacher residency. Right now in the state of Connecticut, we are facing a shortage of teachers of color. There are very few teachers of color who are currently certified or becoming certified in the state of Connecticut. And that creates a challenge for districts that do want to diversify their workforce. We've tried really hard to find candidates of color who could enrich our school community. And the fact is, they don't exist right now. This residency, like a medical residency, will allow aspiring teachers of color to work in the school system this year and receive a salary while they go to school in the evenings, completing all of their certification requirements, and will finish the year earning a Connecticut teaching certification. When they receive that certification, in Guilford, we're participating by offering one of these slots. The individual who participates in the residency here in Guilford, we will have the first opportunity to hire that individual when he or she completes their certification program. And in return for the tuition support that we provided, that individual will owe Guilford the first 3 years of their service. They're fully paid, but they are contracted to us for the first 3 years of their teaching service if we choose to continue their employment. Across Connecticut, this is already beginning to have impact, and it's being, other districts that are participating are districts like Wilton, Westport, Darien, Fairfield. There's a number of school districts that are participating in the same opportunity. And on Tuesday evening, I had the opportunity to listen to some administrators from CREC, the Capital Region Educational Center, who talked about their recent experience with this program. In 1 year after this program, they doubled the number of male teachers of color in their classrooms. They went from 7 to 14 in 1 year. And I heard one parent who talked about the importance of that teacher to his children. And he was white and he was talking about his white children. And he got choked up when he told the story about how his son now has a relationship with this teacher. And it is a teacher that he loves and admires and respects, and who also happens to be a man of color. And he talked about how that is going to change his son's trajectory for the rest of his life because he has that personal relationship. Because like Dr. Torres Rodriguez said, he didn't spend his entire schooling with people who looked just like him. Making connections and building relationships with people who don't look like us helps us as we move through the school system. And that's what we owe to the 84% of our students who might not identify as members of marginalized communities, who might be part of the dominant narrative, but need still to be exposed to individuals who don't look like them, or who have a different cultural background than they, and to be able to have those challenging and difficult conversations about race, or about racism, or about challenging historical events and individuals, because complexity is difficult. It's not easy. We are committed to this work. I know that I've gone over my initial time, Loretta. I'm really sorry, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share this tonight. It's been fun to lay this out from beginning to end. I don't often get the opportunity to do it in this kind of detail, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And Alan and Doug, thank you as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Freeman. We have just a couple of questions and some comments as well. So I'm going to start with the first question from Meg Teep, and I'll hit answer live. What is the difference between culturally responsive and sustaining work versus anti-bias, anti-racist work? What is the plan to address the latter specifically? What work is being done on policies and systems such as bullying, discipline, safe schools, etc.?
So I do appreciate the question. I think we're talking about discipline. When we talk about culturally responsive and sustaining instructional techniques, we're really primarily talking about the educational discipline, and we're talking about the professional training and moves that go towards educators. When you're talking about social justice and anti-bias or racist training more broadly, I think that is now looking at a broader community, societal concern. Specifically, when you ask questions about what is happening at a policy level, you know, I failed to mention it, but again, in early school year 2019, on the heels of the blackface incident, we did work with our policies. We specifically rewrote some of our policies, both around dress code and what would be acceptable or unacceptable, but also in the area of suspension and expulsion, specifically in the area of addressing hate speech. And we rewrote that policy specifically to be more overt in what our expectations were. We have done policy work around our hiring practices, trying to, again, diversify that workforce. Mr. Bowden, who is our Assistant Superintendent for Operations, is working with a national network of other HR professionals, talking about how do we become more robust in our recruiting practices. We're not just going to sit back on this residency and expect it to solve the problem for us. There's more that we need to do there. And then there's also just that adult conversation. It was a year ago tonight, but again, I remain heartbroken that we didn't get to have that community conversation. And this year has remained challenged. But these aren't just conversations that take place in schools about schools. This needs to be conversations about our community. And whether that's the Guilford community or the Connecticut community, we need to be having those conversations at that level. That's why teachers were given a pretty provocative text. That's why they were asked to read how to be an anti-racist. We want our adults in the community to be able to engage in that level of conversation, because that uncomfortable conversation informs the more discipline-based conversation around culturally responsive and sustaining instructional techniques. I don't know if that gets to the question or not, but it's the best I have this late at night.
Thank you. I'm going to keep moving because we do have a few more.
Yep.
So I'll try to be brief with some of these. This is from Alexa Miller, who says, it's wonderful to hear of all of this learning and experts the school is bringing in. Our town is home to some deeply knowledgeable, formally trained scholars of African American studies, as well as Black educators who are residents of the town and quite well positioned to speak on this topic. Is the town planning on, to seek out and engage any of these experts as well?
Yes, and I remain really hopeful that through vehicles like the ABAR committees at our PTOs, through the Guilford Human Rights Commission, and through the school system independently, in the same way that we offered an author talk last year, that we can take advantage of some of those local experts in the same way that we did with Dr. Matoma and with Chris Newell around the mascot conversation. We are really fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of expertise, and we need to be taking more advantage of that. I hope that in addition to the work that continues in the schools, that in the future we begin to see more community conversations, and that we leverage those community resources and opportunities like this one, right? Bringing in other experts who can speak as we continue series like this one that we're part of tonight.
Okay, just probably three more. From Ornella Rulo, amazing talk. Thank you very much. When will Dr. Seiler's audit results be available?
We hope by the end of this school year. We expect it by the end of this school year. And every time that we run into a quarantine or a shutdown at the whole school level, it sort of slows that work down yet again. But he's really committed, and we will have that, we hope, by the end of the school year.
Okay.
Certainly by the summer at the latest.
Follow-ups, is he coming back next year? And will K through 4 be included in the audit?
Undetermined at this time. Right now, our agreement with Dr. Seiler is as I described and through the end of this year. But what I will tell you is that Don is really enjoying working with our Guilford teachers, and I think we have a real opportunity to continue working with him in the future. I think he's committed to this work in this community, and I think there's a good chance that that work will continue in the future. The work will continue in the future. I think there's a good chance Don will be part of that work as we continue into the future.
Thank you. Okay, so we're approaching 8 o'clock, so I'm going to edit two of the last questions. This is regarding the purchase of the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, from David Holman, and I'm going to try to edit this in a successful way. But do you agree that the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist that so he's quoting from the author saying racial discrimination is not inherently racist, i.e. that the defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. If you agree with Mr. Kendi, how are you instituting discrimination in the Guilford school system in their pursuit of equity and to remedy past discrimination?
Yeah,
and I
so
apologize, I kind of butchered that question, but.
it's okay. And I don't know if I'm responding to the way that you edited it or the question itself, but I'm going to disagree with the premise of the question. That quote is cherry picked from a very complicated chapter out of a very complicated book. I believe that in part, the point that Professor Kendi is attempting to make is that you cannot not talk about race. I totally disagree with the position that we are being discriminatory. So in a lot of what I did tonight, we foregrounded race. A lot of the decisions that were discussed tonight were made aware of race. Part of the argument that Professor Kendi makes is that being colorblind won't solve the problems that are inherent in structures or societies or communities or schools or personal relations if you're concerned about systemic racism. That the only way to address it is to talk about it and then address it, just as with any other inequity. And so I disagree with the suggestion that we are introducing discrimination into our schools. I wholeheartedly embrace the idea that we have recognized the need to discuss race and equity and to be okay with the fact that those conversations are uncomfortable. They make me uncomfortable. They make a lot of other people uncomfortable, but we can't get to some of the core issues that we want to address if we don't discuss those items. I think for a long time, we didn't talk about blackface in our classrooms. Dennis Culleton is a Guilford resident, and he's done a lot of work with the Witness Stones Project, and he was a social studies teacher in Guilford for a long time. And he told me that he talked about slavery in his classrooms, but he couldn't remember ever once talking about blackface in its contemporary incarnation and what that means. So one of the first things we did on the heels of that event is we talked to all of our students, 7 through 12. We were careful about trying to be developmentally appropriate, but we first talked. You can't address what's wrong about blackface without talking about race. And I don't agree with the premise that talking about race or making decisions that acknowledge race is discriminatory.
Okay, and another comment from Jennifer Scoggin. Culturally responsive teaching is about exposing students to a variety of stories, identities, and histories. However, ABAR, specifically pedagogy, provides students with tools to identify bias and bigotry and then respond in kind. It also equips them to be more critical consumers of information. What is the plan to move forward from exposure to critique so that our students can imagine and work toward a more just future society?
So I think there's a lot in there, and I think that in many ways we want to do, right, there needs to be sort of a waterfront of all of that. Part of it is, right, we need to choose texts and materials where all students can see themselves, right? We need to make sure that we are, that students feel represented. So we need to be sure that we choose authors and texts and materials where students see people like themselves in those materials. We also need to, and we've done a lot of this work historically in Guilford, and some of it is just being more overt and about connecting it to some other topics. We have worked in our classrooms with accountable talk. Accountable talk is a way to encourage students to take responsibility for the way that they talk academically in their classroom. Guilford students, more than students that I've seen in any other school district in Connecticut, are really capable of listening to each other and being able to thoughtfully, critically, civilly, and respectfully say, I'm sorry, Loretta, I just heard everything that you said, but I really need to disagree with you. I think that it's this, and this is why I feel that way. And we've got 3rd and 4th graders who are really skillful at having those kinds of conversations. If we're talking about things like math problems and some really safe reading assignments, we want to take that skill set then and push it so that they can also apply those skills to things like questions of society and questions of systems and questions of history, so that they can have those really challenging conversations. The graduates that we heard from said they left Guilford, went to more metropolitan areas, whether they were cities or jobs or universities or teaching internationally. And what they found out was that they didn't feel equipped to have conversations about really tough, uncomfortable topics, that they felt like they could do it around the safe things, but they couldn't do it when it got really important and really uncomfortable. And I don't feel that it's our job, and again, we mentioned this in the mascot communication, or I think we mentioned it in the blackface communication too. We're not bringing up issues of race and racism and structure and identity because it makes people uncomfortable. We're bringing them up even though we know it makes people uncomfortable, because our students need to be skilled in doing it. And if we don't confront our students with those conversations now, they will be confronted by them later, and it will be our failure that we didn't prepare them for that. And that conversation, right, has that added benefit. First, we're just meeting our responsibility and preparing our students for moving out into the world. But 2, it has us talking about something that's important that we should be talking about anyway. And we will all become a better community, a more perfect union for having those conversations. I think that it's incredibly American. I think that it's our responsibility to be doing this. I think it's what the charge of schools is, and most specifically this year, the Board of Education charged us to do it on October 13th when they adopted their initiatives for this year. And again, Loretta, I know we're over. I talk a lot. I really apologize.
We are. So I'm going to wrap it up there. It's 8:07. And I thank everyone for coming. And I did not get to everyone's question, and I apologize for that. I'm happy to pass on questions to Dr. Freeman from
Please
here. If you would like me to do that, you can email me at the library if you prefer. But I want to thank you very much, Dr. Freeman, and our group, the Witness to History, Slavery in Guilford. And our next talk, just to plug that, is April 21st. So please join us for that. So thank you again, Dr. Freeman. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here.